All right, hey, good evening, folks. Once again, we are back taking a look at the tropics. Tonight is Thursday, September 29th, 2022. This is your evening update on what is once again Hurricane Ian. Yes, Ian moved off the coast of central eastern Florida here this afternoon and has been taking that more expected northerly turn and is once again a Category 1 hurricane. This is something we talked about this morning, the anticipation that Ian would get back off the coast and then be able to strengthen a little bit. We do not anticipate the storm to blow up anything major, but it is once again a hurricane, and it is taking its sights and aiming them at South Carolina, where the entire southeast U.S. from eastern Georgia all the way up through the Carolinas and Virginia can expect some heavy weather tomorrow and early on Saturday as Ian swings up into your area and makes its final curtain call. So this is the latest on Hurricane Ian as the 8 p.m. advisory from National Hurricane Center. Again, it's wind 75 miles an hour, only up about 5 miles an hour from earlier today. So not a massive change, but enough of a change, again, to cross that hurricane threshold. The movements to the north-northeast at 10 miles an hour. We have hurricane warnings in effect for the entire South Carolina coastline and up to Cape Fear near Wilmington in North Carolina. And then hurricane watches extend all the way up to about Jacksonville or Surf City in North Carolina, just in case, Ian takes that more right side of the cone. Some of those hurricane force winds could reach out, especially in gusts over there. But the storm is massive, guys. Look at the tropical storm force wind field associated with Ian. This is the tropical storm force winds. They extend 415 miles from the center of circulation. Uh, it's pretty amazing. The hurricane force winds go out 45 miles, and again, the tropical storm force winds 415 miles. I mean, this thing's still producing 60 plus mile-an-hour wind gusts in St. Augustine Beach, and the storms, moved a pretty considerable distance offshore and up at this point. Hurricane hunters are flying through Ian tonight, finding that estimated wind speed is probably right about what it should have been. The central pressure is in the mid 980s, and the flight level winds are at about 65, 70 knots. The SFMR is actually reading about 75 knots, which will correspond to about 80, 85 miles an hour. But if you blend the flight level and SFMR, you'll probably get 75 miles an hour with what the Hurricane Center has there. Satellite presentation on the visible, the last light's pretty interesting because you have Ian kind of wrapped up in this cold frontal structure. You have what is a very large, ill-defined center of circulation right here. Look at this sharp cirrus shield right here as that westerly wind works in. But then there's clouds rotating under the cirrus shield. So you're actually seeing two different cloud levels on the satellite presentation. These are all high clouds. These are cirrus clouds streaming out of Ian, and these stream clear all the way up across the across New England and out all the way into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, the trough that has picked Ian up is a freaking monster. And these clouds stream clear off and into the central Atlantic Ocean. You could ride a wave of clouds all the way from Florida to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean near, halfway across the ocean, or more than halfway, probably about 3/4 of the way across the ocean. It's really impressive stuff. But if you look at the looping satellite, you can see these clouds moving out of the backside in the last couple frames. Those are actually stratocumulus clouds, and they're associated with cooler air, as a lot of cool air is wrapped in behind Ian. It's really something to behold. I was talking about, I think in this morning's video, that I live a little bit south and west of Jacksonville, and it was downright cold earlier today. I think I made a post about it on the page. It was 59 degrees at 3 o'clock in the afternoon where I live. I mean, it was like cold with the wind, and that's all thanks to this cold front that Ian is wrapped up in. If we actually go back to the satellite, we can see that Ian has quasi-frontal features. It's probably not fully tropical at this point. It's not enough to be a hybrid. It's not enough to be a subtropical storm at this point, but there is actually a cold front attenuating off of Ian into the south, that cold air rushing around behind into the Florida Peninsula. This is colder, drier air. And over here is more tropical air over in this direction, and then you have a warm front kind of wrapped up right here moving towards the North Carolina coastline. You can see all this on the surface plots of the dew points in the teens right here across northern Florida, but then back into the 20s across southern Florida, and all these winds out of the northwest. And then back over here you have wind directions switching right here, indicating that the cold front, or the warm front rather, is probably somewhere right about here. So if you draw these fronts, you kind of have a cold front and you have your warm front. So you can almost draw fronts on Ian if you really wanted to, which is interesting that we actually have a kind of a hybrid storm on our hands. But Ian is expected to make landfall somewhere in South Carolina, and there's a couple different looks here from our different models. The HWRF and HMON we're going to use here. showing the EM will likely begin to deepen a little bit as it approaches, coming in at about 983 millibars. HRF initialized a little actually high on the pressure, given what the hurricane hunters found, so it could be even a little bit lower than this. But you can see the landfall point is actually somewhere up near Myrtle Beach, and this is where the HMON actually agrees same pressure and almost the same landfall point, and even the GFS showing the same landfall pressure, but showing that is a little bit further south, more towards Charleston. But we believe that landfall point will be somewhere between Charleston and Myrtle Beach, is what it looks like given the trends that we saw today. This also lines up with our global models. You can see the Hurricane Center's official forecast in black is kind of on the the western side of the evening trend guidance, which does show that landfall again somewhere around or just up the coast from Charleston. Showing you again how this is actually going to take place since we have this sort of hybrid storm on our hands. The effects from Ian are actually going to start well before the landfall of the storm. A lot of this weather is going to kind of pinwheel around the center and push up in early. That warm front is going to kind of push into the Carolinas, and it's going to bring in a lot of that moisture early. This is set for 6Z on Friday. This is 2 a.m. local time, and a lot of that upper level moisture has already moved into the Carolinas, even though Ian's center is still actually well south of South Carolina. By this point in the morning, you see that dry air wrapping around the backside of the storm, and a lot of that weather moving in out ahead of it, where that kind of warm front is. And you'll have the threat of heavy rainfall and the potential for tornadoes even as early as this morning before sunrise as Ian approaches across the North Carolina, South Carolina coastlines. And given that gigantic wind field of Ian, you will already likely have tropical storm force winds, especially in gusts, moving ashore before it shows up. And then the GFS kind of has this kind of pinwheel up and in, landfalling sometime on Friday afternoon, about 2 o'clock local time. And notice this thick band of tropical moisture moves into parts of the Delmarva region. I mean, all the way up into parts of New Jersey even. You get a lot of tropical moisture surging up into this area, and it's going to be a lot of rainfall associated with that. The NAM-NEST model shows this again pretty well. We'll go back to tonight, where most of the weather is hanging out offshore, but you can see that line begins to really move in. And this line right here, especially going into the early morning hours, is going to contain really heavy rain and the potential for tornadoes as it moves in. And then you see the core of Ian moves up with a heavier rainfall moving in. It's going to be a rough ride in South Carolina. Don't underestimate the storm. It's a big storm, and how we always explain this is there's a big difference in a Category 1 Ian and a tropical storm that forms, say 2 days before landfall. A tropical storm forms off the coast of South Carolina, and then it moves in, and it like grazes Category 1 intensity, and there's like a sliver of the storm that makes 75-mile-an-hour winds, and we call it a Category 1 hurricane. That's not the same as Category 1 Hurricane Ian, the former Category top end 4 that's been a storm for several days and has had eyewall replacements, and now it has cold frontal energy working into it, and is a massive 400-mile wide hurricane. Not the same thing. We're talking about a much more powerful storm, and the impacts are going to be much more than what a typical quote unquote Category 1 would be. So don't think that Ian is not going to bring some significant impacts up and down the South Carolina coast and into North Carolina as well. I think people in North Carolina are probably be like, wow, this was actually pretty bad, and for that reason. Let's go ahead and talk impacts real quick. The storm surge still expected to be up to 4 to 7 feet across parts of the South Carolina coastline. This could actually spread a little bit further if Ian winds up coming a little more towards Myrtle Beach. This 4 to 7 foot number could actually go up to Cape Fear, I think. But look at the water rise all the way up to the Outer Banks and then back down to parts of Georgia are expecting water rises in that 4 to 7 foot range. 7 foot of storm surge is no joke. I mean, that's absolutely nothing to play with, and I hope people are being evacuated and taking that seriously along the coast, because that's going to be a big impact. The rainfall expected from Ian is also pretty high, generally about in that 2 to 6 inch range for much of the region, but there will be pockets that get higher, especially where that core, kind of off to where the core comes ashore. You'll have a couple of heavier bands set up, and you can kind of see that back on the NAM-NEST model, like this sort of notch right here. Kind of we explained that in the videos yesterday, that V notch that it makes. That will be really torrential rainfall. Like that's what affected Flagler and Volusia counties this morning, and what affected Orlando last night. And that sort of core of those rains are really heavy, 2, 3, 4 inch per hour rainfall rates that will produce some pretty tremendous amounts of flooding. So looking for that somewhere around central or northern South Carolina's coastline, around Charleston, where 6 to 10 plus inches could fall. I think isolated amounts could go up to a foot, and that will definitely cause some flash flooding. Where the Weather Prediction Center has a significant risk of flash flooding over the next couple of days, slight to moderate on their impact scale. We also have the potential for tornadoes, as I've mentioned. The Storm Prediction Center has a 5% risk of tornadoes and a slight risk at category 2 out of 5 on their scale. And because of Ian will kind of have that pseudo warm frontal boundary moving in, that'll also help to focus the risk for tornadoes. You'll have the overall generally rotating atmosphere, the frontal boundary, and the land friction all competing together to produce some significant tornado risk. I don't think a major outbreak is forecast, but I would no doubt expect several tornadoes tomorrow. And look how the trends actually push much more into North Carolina than they do South Carolina. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, where that warm frontal energy is, you won't have as much of that in South Carolina. So that I think the focus will be on the eastern North Carolina area, where some severe weather and probably some heavy gusts and tornadoes could all be expected in those outer bands. Again, well before Ian arrives, and then even if you're nowhere near the landfall point, could still have some really rough weather tomorrow across that area. And then tropical storm force wind gusts are expected for the entirety of the region from eastern Georgia through South Carolina, North Carolina, even into Virginia. Wind gusts 40, 55 miles an hour are expected, and that goes all the way up to the Appalachian Mountains. So, overall, expect that. Now, Ian does get out of here by Saturday for the most part. It wraps up pretty quick in an upper trough and moves off. You'll have some rain and wind associated with Ian as it does finally move away, but a lot of this region will dry out quickly as that dry air rushes in and turns off the rainfall for the area. So that's what I got for Ian tonight, guys. The other thing I wanted to mention is we still unfortunately have to watch the rest of the tropics tonight. We do have two more tropical waves we're monitoring. Hurricane Center monitoring a wave leaving Africa. This has a pretty good chance to develop as it moves northward, but it looks like this wave will actually move pretty much north and will probably develop, but not likely impact anyone in the eastern U.S. But we also have this little sneaky wave right here, as pointed out by some folks on Twitter, including Eric Webb. He's a government meteorologist, and he tracks stuff like this, and he's talking about this wave here and how we'll have to watch this over the next week or so as we get into the middle of next week. A tropical upper tropospheric trough, what he's talking about there, a TUT, and a convectively coupled Kelvin wave, as what the other abbreviation is, will sort of combine. And the bottom line is this tropical wave is going to kind of run silently for the next couple of days. It's going to kind of run through here, but then when it gets into the lower Caribbean, we will have to watch it, as it looks like conditions will be a little bit more favorable for development. This is normally a graveyard, but late in the season, the Caribbean can become very hospitable to waves. And if we remember, Ian started life as a tropical wave just like this that ran almost all the way down into Venezuela and Colombia and all the other South American countries my geography fails me for, and then popped up into the Caribbean, went up, and then went through Florida and is now going to do its thing. So something we'll have to watch. Not saying there's any repeats of Ian coming, but this is something computer models may not pick up, but it's something we are watching carefully over the next week or so. But there are no tropical threats for the next several days in the Atlantic Basin, but the season is not over, and October can produce a lot of storms, and I'll leave it with this. We know that switch has flipped with Fiona and Ian, and sometimes that switch does not turn off just because a bad hurricane hit. The Mother Nature does not care, and we have to stay vigilant and stay prepared throughout the rest of the month until hurricane season actually ends. So that's what I got for you guys tonight on your topical update. We'll keep an eye on the rest of this, and we'll be back soon with more information. Until then, stay safe and have a good one.